In the long sweep of British history, kings and queens have carried many titles. Some are remembered as conquerors, some as reformers, some as tyrants. Yet one monarch has passed into memory with a label that overshadows all else: the Mad King. For many, the phrase evokes images of wild eyes, incoherent rambling, and the downfall of royal dignity. But who was this monarch, and what was the truth behind the madness? The answer leads us to George III, the king who reigned longer than any of his predecessors, who presided over one of the most turbulent periods in British history, and who became forever known as the Mad King. His story is not merely one of illness, but of empire, revolution, personal suffering, and the frailty of human life behind the facade of monarchy. George III was born in 1738, the grandson of King George II. Unlike many of his Hanoverian forebears, he was born and raised in Britain. He spoke English as his first language, was educated with care, and styled himself not as a foreign prince transplanted onto the British throne, but as a native son of his people. In 1760, at the age of 22, he became king. His accession was greeted with relief. Here was a young, moral, dutiful monarch, untainted by the scandals that had dogged his predecessors. He declared in his first speech that he gloried in the name of Britain. For decades, he worked tirelessly, involving himself in government, supporting science, agriculture, and education, and building the image of a domestic king devoted to his family. He and his wife, Queen Charlotte, raised 15 children, and their family life was held up as a model of stability. Yet the reign of George III was anything but tranquil. Almost from the beginning, he was tested by the strains of empire. Across the Atlantic, his North American colonies bristled at taxation without representation. The Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, the Boston Tea Party, each crisis widened the gulf between king and colonists. George was determined to maintain the authority of Parliament and the integrity of the empire. When rebellion broke out, he called it a most unnatural rebellion. By the mid-1770s, the American Revolution was underway, and the king became the face of tyranny in the eyes of the revolutionaries. The Declaration of Independence denounced him as a monarch unfit to rule a free people. Though the British government bore much of the responsibility for mismanaging colonial policy, it was George's name and person that became the symbol of oppression. The loss of the American colonies in 1783 was a crushing blow. For the first time in generations, Britain had suffered a major defeat. George, though shaken, did not collapse. He shifted focus to Europe, to domestic reforms, and to strengthening the monarchy's moral authority. In these years, he also became a patron of science and the arts, collecting books and scientific instruments, encouraging agriculture, and taking a keen interest in astronomy and natural philosophy. Far from a figure of derision, he was admired by many as a hard-working king, committed to the well-being of his subjects. But in 1788, a shadow fell that would never truly lift. George suffered the first of a series of mysterious illnesses that would eventually brand him as the Mad King. The symptoms were alarming. He spoke incessantly, sometimes for hours without pause, his words tumbling out in confused torrents. He gesticulated wildly, sweated profusely, and seemed unable to control his emotions. At times he grew violent, shouting obscenities, lashing out at those around him. At other times he was euphoric, singing and talking to trees as though they were people. The court alarmed Parliament. The physicians of the age were baffled. Medicine in the 18th century had little understanding of mental illness. Treatments were crude, often cruel, blistering, purging, straitjackets and isolation. Rumours flew through London that the king had gone permanently insane. Caricaturists seized upon the image, portraying him as a babbling madman, crown askew, while ministers schemed about who might govern in his stead. The crisis reached a climax in 1889, when Parliament debated a regency that would hand power to the king's eldest son, the extravagant and unpopular Prince of Wales. Just as the regency was about to be enacted, George recovered. The symptoms faded, his mind cleared, and he resumed his duties. The reprieve was dramatic, and for a time it seemed as though the darkness had passed. But the episodes returned. In 1801, amid the strains of war with Napoleonic France, the king relapsed. Again he raved and rambled, again physicians struggled, again the nation feared collapse. Yet once more he recovered, enough to greet the new century with determination. It was during this period that he earned the nickname Farmer George, a term meant half in mockery and half in affection. He had a genuine passion for agriculture, took pride in his farms, and was often seen in simple country clothes. To many, this made him approachable, more like a country squire than a remote monarch. To others, it seemed proof of eccentricity, a sign that the king was not quite in step with the dignity of his station. But by 1810, the illness returned with greater ferocity than ever before. George was 72, weary from decades of rule, scarred by the death of his beloved daughter Amelia, and overwhelmed by the pressures of war against Napoleon. This time, the madness did not lift. His speech became incoherent, his thoughts fragmented. He was seen talking to himself, sometimes to unseen spirits. He would play the harpsichord for hours, lost in a world only he could perceive. Courtiers whispered of his wild outbursts, his delusions, his pitiful decline. In 1811, Parliament enacted the Regency Act, transferring power to the Prince of Wales, who became Prince Regent and later George IV. For the last 9 years of his life, George III lived in seclusion at Windsor, blind, deaf, and deranged, a tragic shell of the vigorous monarch he had once been. What then was the nature of his illness? For centuries, historians and doctors debated the cause. Some believed it was porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that can cause hallucinations, abdominal pain, and bluish discoloration of the urine. The theory gained traction in the late 20th century, supported by analysis of George's medical records. Yet more recent studies have cast doubt, suggesting instead that the king may have suffered from bipolar disorder, a condition characterized by cycles of mania and depression. The truth may never be known with certainty. What is clear is that George's illness was both mental and physical, that it came in waves, and that it devastated him and his family. The tragedy of George III is that his legacy was so defined by this illness that it obscured his achievements. He was the first of the Hanoverians to embrace a British identity wholeheartedly. He restored respect to the monarchy after decades of scandal. He guided his country through wars that reshaped the world, including the final defeat of Napoleon. He encouraged science, agriculture, and culture. And yet, because of the spectacle of his madness, because of the gossip and caricatures, he is remembered above all as the Mad King. The phrase itself carries cruelty. To call a monarch mad is to reduce a complex human being to a caricature, to dismiss decades of rule with a single word. It also reflects the fears of the age. In the 18th century, madness was seen not as illness, but as moral failure, a shameful weakness. For a king, the embodiment of order, to fall into disorder was terrifying. It suggested that the stability of the realm itself could unravel. That is why courtiers and ministers went to such lengths to hide or downplay his condition, why his family censored accounts, and why his final years were cloaked in silence at Windsor. Yet even in his madness, there were moments of pathos that reveal the man behind the myth. He would speak of his lost daughter Amelia with tears streaming down his face. He would ask about his people, expressing concern for their welfare as even his own mind fractured. He would play music, seeking solace in melody when words failed. These glimpses remind us that beneath the crown was a father, a husband, a man wrestling with an illness he could neither understand nor control. In the end, George III